Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second session of the webinar of the Research Facility on Inequalities. I'm Anda David, a research officer with IFD and the scientific coordinator of the facility. This program, funded by the EU and implemented by IFD, comprises of more than 20 research projects on inequality, and we have launched this webinar series in order to present some of the results. We therefore invite you to join us every Monday at 5 p.m. Paris time to talk about a large array of the topics from taxation, social protection, public service delivery, health and education, etc., all of them with an inequality lenses. Last week, we had the pleasure of hosting a presentation on perceptions of inequality and social mobility in Mexico, given by Aurora Ramirez of Colegio de Mexico. Just before we kick off the webinar, a few guidelines on how this will go. As you can see, you have a Q&A feature at the right of the screen, and you can type your questions, and the presenter will respond them after the presentation. However, I invite the co-author who is present to respond any clarification questions that might arise during the presentation. All the questions are public, and you can also vote for those that you think are more relevant. After the presentation, I will collect them and I will address them to our panelists. Finally, the webinar is recorded and the replay will be available. Given that today is a public holiday in France, those of you who are based here can also enjoy the rest of the long weekend. But you won't get a chance to ask any questions, so it might be better to stick around. Now, let me introduce you our panelist, Rocco Zizamia, a research affiliate of the African Center of Excellence for Inequalities Research, who will present the paper Earning Inequality over the Life Course in South Africa, co-written with Vimal Ranchad. Welcome, Rocco, and you have 30 minutes for your presentation. I will change and Rocco, yeah, you're here, perfect. You have the floor now.
Thanks, Anda. Thanks so much. It's always strange to do a presentation in front of an empty screen, except for my own face. So it's a pity we're not in the same room. But thanks for joining today. So I'll be speaking about some work that I'm doing with Vimal Ranchad, also at the African Center of Excellence for Inequality Research, which is based at Seldru at UCT. It's ongoing research, so these are mostly preliminary results. Very interested in any feedback that you can give. I'm also happy Vimal is, as Anda said, is online as well, and will be able to respond to any clarificatory questions during the seminar. I'm also happy to take those if you want to hand them over to me, Vims. But then afterwards, I'll answer any remaining questions. So the topic today is earnings inequality over the life course in South Africa. The motivation for doing this research is starts from the fact that most inequality measures, as you well know, usually use a moment-in-time snapshot of income or consumption or earnings. And there are good reasons to believe that using a snapshot moment-in-time measure may be less meaningful than a measure of inequality of income, consumption, or earnings, which is measured over time. So perhaps a useful example here, a metaphor which has become quite famous, is Schumpeter's hotel. So he asks us to imagine a hotel in which there are many rooms. The cheap, cramped rooms are at the bottom of the hotel, and there are a few very expensive penthouse suites at the top. At any given point in time, there are very few people. There are a small number of people who occupy those top suites, and there is a large number of people who are cramped in the bottom in the rooms at the bottom of the hotel. So if we were to look at that hotel at any given moment in time, we would sort of conclude that we're facing an unequal state of affairs. What Schumpeter asked us to imagine, though, was that every night the guests switched rooms randomly, and if cross-sectional inequality coexists with social mobility, which is shuffling the deck essentially between these hotel rooms, we might reach different conclusions regarding the inequality of society. And I think this sort of neatly brings into relief the importance of both measuring inequality in a cross-sectional way as well as over time. An additional dynamic which Schumpeter didn't speak about explicitly in that example is that there might be a systematic movement of people as they age. So using the hotel example again, perhaps people start out in the bottom cramped rooms, but systematically move up over time. This might be, for instance, if there's a positive age earnings relationship. Young workers, we know, earn less on average than older workers. And this might be a dynamic that also leads us to conclude different things about inequality measured over time compared to cross-sectionally. Coming back to the case at hand, though, measuring inequality over the long term, especially over a life course, is extremely demanding in terms of the data requirements. Ideally, we would have a long-term life course panel which follows people as they enter the labor market at 18 years old and as they leave at, say, 60 years old. But very few countries have access to this sort of panel data, and in developing countries, there aren't any that have access to this long-term panel data. So what we do is using South Africa as a case study, is we construct a synthetic lifetime panel using an existing data set which spans panel data set which spans 9 years. Once we've constructed the synthetic panel, we then are able to compare cross-sectional earnings inequality to inequality over the medium term. That's using the genuine panel, or to the or across the life course. That's using the the synthetic lifetime panel. So just to be clear about what the objectives of this paper are, if we had this a genuine long-term panel, this presentation would be 5 minutes. It would just be describing that data and giving a Gini estimate. However, so that's the ultimate objective of this work. But in the absence of this long-term panel, we need to manipulate the data that we've got, and most of what I speak about is going to be discussing how exactly we manipulate this 9-year genuine panel to create a synthetic lifetime panel. So I'm going to ask you to imagine 2 stylized cases which illustrate two different dynamics which might co-occur and which might lead to differences between cross-sectional earnings inequality and earnings inequality measured over the long term. So looking at case number 1 here, we've got an economy of 2 agents, Jack and Jill, over 3 periods, T, T+1, and T+2. Jack enters, let's start with Jill. Jill enters the labor market in T and earns £1. Jill's earnings grow over time as she ages, and in T+1, she earns £2, but in T+2, she's exited the labor market or died. Jack demonstrates exactly the same earnings trajectory as Jill, except Jack is a little bit younger and enters the labor market only in T+1. So we can see that if we measure inequality at T+1, we would see that there's inequality in that in this economy, but that inequality simply reflects the fact that we're measuring these 2 different agents at different points in their life. Over time, their earnings are precisely equal at £3 each. So this age earnings relationship here, if a positive age earnings relationship exists, we'd expect this to be decreasing inequality measured over time relative to cross-sectional inequality. In the second case here, we've got an economy of 3 agents, Jack, Jill, and Jim, over 2 time periods. In time t, Jack earns £5, Jill earns £10, and Jim earns 0. In time t plus 1, Jack has lost his low-wage job. Jill has kept her high-wage job, so she's still earning £10, and Jim has gained a low-wage job. So this is an economy in which there's a positive correlation between low earnings and vulnerability. So we see that those people who earn less at any moment in time are also more likely to leave, to exit employment or to lose their job. Whereas those people who are earning high wages are more likely to keep their job over time. So inequality measured at any cross-section is going to be less than the inequality in total earnings over the life course. In reality, these 2 processes, let's call the one the positive age earnings relationship and the other one inequalities in employment dynamics, in reality, these two processes co-occur, and it's unclear ex ante which is going to dominate or over what time span these 2 processes are most evident. Excuse me. All right, so turning now to South African data, this is the National Income Dynamics Study cross-section. What we're looking at here is the age earnings profile. On the horizontal axis is age, on the vertical axis is earnings. And so you'll see on average, there's a positive age earnings relationship. Sorry, I should have said, this excludes the unemployed. So this is only looking at positive earnings, not looking at transitions into and out of employment. So we see on average that there's a positive age earnings profile. As people age, their wages go up. There are inequalities in the extent to which there is this wage growth across racial lines, for instance, or across education. It could also show gender or rural-urban divides. But on average, there is this positive age earnings profile does hold expectedly. If we include those people who aren't in the labor market, or those people who exit the labor market, what we see is that on average, there's still this positive age earnings profile, but that workers start exiting, start losing jobs around their late 40s, and that there's consequently a decline in the age earnings relationship after that point. So on average, going back to case 1, we can say that there is evidence that there is this dynamic that would decrease inequality when measured over time. Now looking at case 2, whether there's this positive correlation between low wages and employment volatility, what we've got here is simply, now we're looking at the National Income Dynamics Study panel, the balanced panel. So in the leftmost column, you've got the number, we observe individuals over 5 periods in the balanced panel. So you can see whether they're employed for 0 periods, 1 periods, 2, 3, 4, or 5 periods. And in the second column from the left is their average positive earnings in those periods that they were employed. So we see that those people who are only employed in 1 out of 5 periods, that's infrequently employed, have substantially lower earnings on average compared to those who are employed in 5 out of 5 periods. So it's exactly this dynamic that we see in case 2, also holds in the South African context. So now that we've got sort of we've got evidence that these 2 processes are co-occurring, what we want to do is to create this synthetic lifetime panel. And I see there's been a question. I'll leave that unless it's addressed to me. Okay. So now we want to create this lifetime synthetic panel. So ideally, as I said before, we'd have a panel of individuals from the age of labor market entry to the age of labor market exit. We don't have this, this genuine lifetime panel. So we're going to try and create a panel of synthetic individuals who have valid observations from the age at which they enter the labor market to the age at which they exit. So the intuition here is that we're going to try and link younger individuals to similar older individuals so as to form a chain of observations across the life course. So I'm going to try and explain this in an abstract way, and then we'll look at how we implement this in the NIDS data. But what we're going to need is at least 2 waves of panel data. This panel data would observe people at various ages across the life course. So there would be, for instance, in the first wave of this panel data, there would be people aged 18, 19, 20, so on until 60 years old. In the second wave, the same. So what we do is we start with those people who are aged 18 in wave 1, who are then aged 19 in wave 2. We match them with an older cohort, which is aged 19 in wave 1 and 20 in wave 2, based on the shared age interval, that is 19. So if you look at the stylized table at the bottom here, we see we're starting with those people in black. They're aged 18 in wave 1, 19 in wave 2. Then we match them with a cohort with a slightly older cohort, which was aged 19 in wave 1 and 20 in wave 2. Because there's this age overlap, they're both aged 19 at some point, the younger cohort in wave 1, the older cohort in wave 2, we can match them on both time varying and time invariant characteristics. So whether they're white or black, for instance, but also whether they're employed or unemployed at age 19. Once we've matched using nearest neighbor matching, the cohort aged 18 in wave 1 to the cohort aged 19 in wave 1, we simply substitute the observations that we have for the observation in red here, substitute that. We append those observations to the individual that we observed who is aged 18 in wave 1. That's this black number 1. So now once we've done that, we've got valid observations for the first for this black row for age 18, 19, and 20, because we've spliced in, or we've appended observations of this red row to the black row. Once we've done that, we can repeat the process, now matching the new synthetic individual, which is the black row plus the new red 20 observation, to the third row, which contains individuals who are aged 20 in wave 1 and 21 in wave 2. And we repeat this process until we have a continuous chain of observations from the age of labor market entry to the age of labor market exit. You can see that represented in row 1. We've got 2 genuine observations, 18 and 19, and we've appended these observations using matched individuals that we observe at older ages in the same waves. So hopefully I've not lost anyone, because this is the sort of that was the tricky part of the data exercise, and now we're going to bring that to MidPanel data. So different from the stylized example that I just gave you, where we only have two waves of panel data, in NIDS we've got 5 waves of panel data spanning 9 years. So what we do is we sort individuals into 3-year age intervals. So individuals in the table below, between 17 and 19, 20 to 22, 23 to 25, etc. We then exploit the length of the NIDS panel. So we know in this example, we were matching on 1 and extending by 1. Here we're going to match on 2 and extend by 2. So in the black row and the blue row here, we've got 4 age intervals at which we observe individuals. And the blue row shows that we're going to match based on 2 periods of data at which we observe this age overlap and extend by 2. And we repeat that process. What we then do is we do the same process for 1 year later. So essentially what we're able to do here is to repeat this process for 2 subsamples of the data and then append them. So that means that we increase our sample size relative to using only 1 base cohort. And the fact that we're able to match on multiple periods improves the quality of the match, but also decreases the impact of stochastic events on life course trajectories. So what I mean by that is because we're extending by two periods, let's use employment as an example. So we observe this blue individual to be employed in these 2 periods. They've matched with the younger cohort who was employed in those 2 periods at which they were matched. What in the matched individual, the blue observation here, we see that person loses employment in period 29 to 31, but regains employment in period 32 to 34. If we were extending only by 1, we would have seen that person lose employment and would then have matched with a later cohort, or would have been more likely to match with a later cohort who was unemployed rather than employed. But if that was a stochastic labor market shock, by extending by 2 and matching by 2, we're able to mitigate the impact of the stochastic events on determining a synthetic life course trajectory in this case. I'm happy to expand on these points. I realize it might be a bit much to take in. Okay, so having done this data exercise, we've now created a synthetic lifetime panel of individuals, or a panel of synthetic individuals, to be precise. Then we can simply compute a Gini coefficient for this synthetic panel. So in the red here on the left-hand side, let's focus on the bottom row first. So the bottom row here includes those people who are observed to be unemployed, who've got zero earnings. So this is the inequality including 0 earnings. The top row excludes 0 earnings. So it's the Gini coefficient only considering positive earnings. Focusing on the bottom row first, in the red, we've got the standard cross-sectional Gini coefficient. So we've got a Gini coefficient of 0.80 for the NIDS cross-section. In the blue here, we've got the intertemporal Gini calculated on the basis of the genuine NIDS panel. So what we do here is we add observations for 2 waves in the first 2 waves, 3 waves, 4 waves, or 5 waves. We add those observations together. So looking just at the 2 waves, we add earnings observations for 2 waves together and divide them and simply divide it by 2. So what we see is that there's an increase in inequality over 2 waves or over 3 waves. And way of interpreting that is that this inequality in employment dynamics is likely leading to this increase in inequality over the short term. That is, unemployed people are more likely to remain unemployed, and high wage earners are more likely to retain their jobs. and that leads to an increase in inequality, or likely leads to an increase in inequality over the short to medium term. What we see, though, is that this increase starts to diminish as we go over 4 waves, which is now 6 years, or 5 waves, which is 9 years. And one explanation for this decrease in the intertemporal Gini might be that aging dynamics start to be felt once we look at the longer term. In green here we calculate Gini of lifetime earnings using the synthetic panel, which I've just described, and we see here quite a dramatic reduction in earnings over the life course. So this sort of confirms the view, or the interpretation, that over the short term there's an increase in inequality due to employment dynamics, but over the long term the positive age earnings relationship decreases inequality. So the similar interpretations apply for the inequality in positive earnings. That's the top row here. Cross-sectional Gini is 0.53. It increases over the short term, and here this increases it increases over the medium term. This increase is mechanical because at the cross-section we exclude zeros, but using the genuine panel here, those periods of zero earnings, those periods of unemployment come into it. So if someone was earning 0 wage in one period and 1,000 Rand in the second period, we just add those two numbers together and divide them by 2. So you've suddenly got a valid observation for someone over 2 years or 4 years, 6 years, 9 years, where you didn't. So the unemployment dynamics here essentially are driving up the Gini coefficient of the medium term. But again, we see this decrease over the life course. So to conclude, lifetime earnings inequality is expectedly lower than a point-in-time estimate. It seems here that the effect of aging dynamics is dominant over the long course. However, employment dynamics increase inequality in the short to medium term relative to a point-in-time estimate, and that's due to employment dynamics rather than aging dynamics. I should just, before I stop, I should just say that this finding that there's a decrease in lifetime inequality is not a sort of optimistic finding, or inequality is not as bad in South Africa as we thought. It's an entirely different metric. It's capturing a different thing, and I think we'd need to understand how to interpret that decrease in inequality as measured over the life course. We'd have to compare that to other countries and other developing countries in particular. Yep, I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, okay. So I will also invite them on stage. Thanks to all of you for being here and asking some very interesting questions. Normally, so Vimal, the author, will also join us, and if you have other questions that come up with the discussion, feel free to type them in the Q&A box. Welcome, Vimal.
Anda,
yeah.
Can I have my slides back? Is that possible?
Yes, of course. Just in case you need them, I can just put them back on. Up. There you go. So maybe we should start with the clarification questions, because there was a small issue and Vimal was not able to answer them during the presentation. And I think David had one of them on the number of observations and how many data points and NIDs are used. And also there's another question from Jackson on the variables used for the sampling besides age.
Right. Okay. So starting with David's question. Nice to see you join, David. Yeah, so we end up with here we go. So the balanced panel is on the left-hand side here. There are about 8,500 valid observations restricting to adults between 18 and 60 in the balanced panel. It goes down to 1,171 for the lifetime panel. So that's actually quite high. And the reason that that's high relative to the full balanced panel is thanks to South Africa's age pyramid. So we've got much more younger people. So the base. So the base sample, the base cohorts, which we use to match to later cohorts, is relatively large, and then because we're matching with replacement, we maintain that sample size. Then the second question was about what variables, if I understood correctly, what variables we match individuals on. If that's the question. We're matching individuals on. Okay, we're matching individuals based on occupation, race, age, gender, location. Yeah, I might be missing something, but that's it. It is something that we need to play around with for sure. Is the matching strategy, and if you have any suggestions, I'd like to hear them.
And I think there was a second question from David, whether it's inevitable that the synthetic controls has lower inequality, or if we can just simply multiply each observation.
Sorry, Anda, which question is this?
Is it inevitable that the synthetic cohort has lower inequality because you can turn multiple people into a single person, and in reality, those multiple people would have diverged, but you don't allow that. It's another question from David, and then there are a few more.
Can I?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, please
go ahead.
Vimal.
I mean, that's a great question, David. It's not inevitable. It may be that it happens in the end, but it's certainly not a priori inevitable. Because one of the things that we're doing is we're matching on demographic characteristics, as Rocco said, and also on your employment status, like basically your status and your occupation. So to the extent that you're getting lifelong stratification into higher growth occupations and lower growth occupations, there's going to be, at least you could match people on those trajectories. That's the point, I guess. So like if you've got someone who's a financial manager in an investment house and we've got enough of them, then that person will track out the older financial manager in the investment house. And so it's not inevitable, but we do run into a different problem, which is that because our population pyramid is bottom heavy, the matching process has fewer and fewer people in successive age cohorts to match from. And that's going to necessarily lead to a type of bunching dynamic. But it's still not clear that it is going to force the distribution to start to converge with older and older ages. We haven't looked at it yet, though.
Okay, thanks so much. There's a question from Eva Maria on whether you can address the drivers of lifetime inequality with this approach of synthetic panels.
Yeah, it's a great question as well. So on my concluding slide here, so we want to look a little bit. We want to look at education and the role of returns to education a little bit more in this regard. Yeah. So I don't know, Holmes, if you want to add anything to that, but that's a good point, and I think it should be useful. For that.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, we're still trying to get it to work, so we haven't thought of all the places we can go from here. But certainly that would be a cool way to, if we can convince ourselves that this is a useful data set, then there's lots of other questions which follow on, which we can also start to investigate with this. That's
And
the
that,
foremost.
I was actually wondering whether you can split your results as you do them by, let's say, race or by gender at least, and see how this change actually in the genie appears at different layers.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And we've talked about that. I mean, that's a great point. So one of the things that matching algorithms do is they take variables and you choose which variables, and then they create a score, right? And if you just put it in a dummy variable for gender, then it kind of, the maximum likelihood process will try to find, okay, how many years of education would be equivalent on your Z-score as gender. In South African case, it'll go the other way because women have more years of education. But anyway, the point is that you can do it like that, or you can just impose. You can only match within a group. So for gender, we can certainly do it, and we have discussed it because I'm almost sure it will matter a lot. All the other research we have says that gender is a clear fault line in the South African labor market. And for gender, we can. For other things like race, it's a little bit harder because, especially for minority races, again, we run into this constant panel problem where, with older cohorts, because the population pyramid dynamic is always there, there's fewer and fewer people of, for example, Indian race groups. And at that point, either we must lose them or we let the software algorithm match the old Indian person to the most similar other person. And so those are kind of some of the trade-offs which we can't escape in this exercise.
Yeah, I think it would, as you say, if it's possible to do it by gender, it makes even more sense when we talk about life course, given how segmented employment trajectories are for women compared to men, for instance. Yeah. And Joshua actually had more of the same question I had when I saw this paper for the first time, so I'm quite happy about this, and I'll read it because his examples are way better than mine at that time. It seems that the method can account for changes in the external context over time. Well, I don't think it makes a lot of sense if I read it because I think everyone can see it. And yeah, maybe if you can expand on how you take into account this issue of context of entering the labor market when building the synthetic panel. It might be interesting to have this discussion.
Yeah, no, I think that's the sort of Achilles heel of an exercise like this, especially in a context which has undergone sort of secular change like South Africa has. I get the two issues, two questions. The first is whether this is such a devastating issue that the exercise is no longer worthwhile, and I mean there may be a case for that. The other question is precisely, Josh, what you bring up is can something be done about this to account for some of these secular changes? And you've suggested here getting around this by allowing for changes in returns to characteristics over time. I mean, it sounds exciting. I don't know. I can't think quickly how exactly one would go about doing that. And if you have any ideas, I'd love to hear. Perhaps Vims, you've got a better sense of how one might go about doing that. Or if Josh, if you want to come in, I think we can promote you to. If you do have something to say, just say.
So I don't have anything to say except that it's a good point, Josh. And this is something Anda raised the first time we presented this as well, that we have to make a stability assumption. You can't do this exercise without the stability assumption. And as we know that the older cohorts who would have entered the labor market even in the 80s experienced a completely different world and different career paths and different experiences and different opportunities to someone who was 20 years old in 2008. And that being said, as Rocco said, there's nothing we can do about that from an analytical perspective. Now, what you're describing in your second column, I think, is something a little bit more sophisticated, which is to say, try to estimate externally equivalence points and then impose that onto the matching algorithm. Is that correct, what you're saying?
Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure I have enough to warrant being invited on stage, but just
You always do, Josh.
no, yeah, I hadn't thought much about how you do it, but exactly, yeah, I mean, I was just wondering if one could do, it would mean adding a lot more structure to the process, but, you know, maybe even using some kind of like Oaxaca blender decomposition or something, and actually seeing like what are these, if you actually were to model people's labor market earnings, taking into account both that, you know, some people have similar characteristics and you want to link people with similar characteristics, but then you kind of project an income out of that based on what you look like, the returns to those characteristics look like. But with that being said, this is my first time seeing the method, so I haven't thought much about how feasible it would be, but it was just something that I wondered about.
So thinking about education, for instance, what you would, this would be a larger problem if you are matching, let's say, 18-year-olds today with 60-year-olds on education, right? Like most 18-year-olds in South Africa have at least some higher education. Probably not most 60-year-olds, especially not most Black 60-year-olds in South Africa have high school education, have some high school. So it would be a problem if we were matching, or it would be a greater problem if we were matching those sort of greatly different cohorts. But what we're actually doing is we're matching 18-year-olds in 2008 with 20-year-olds in 2008. So and the differences, so because you're matching relatively close age cohorts and extending in that way, and because we're not sort of constraining the matching process to match within education, for instance, we're not imposing that structure on it, as Wim said, you might even, the algorithm might just make those sort of trade-offs naturally. As there are fewer people, let's say from 45 to 47, as there are fewer people to match with a complete matric, it'll make that trade-off and match on other characteristics rather. So I'm not saying that there isn't a problem here, and that this isn't something that sort of we shouldn't grab the bull by the horns, but I think I don't know, just thinking through that education example made me less like alarmed, I guess.
Okay. Thank you. I'll remove Joshua unless, I don't know if you want to add anything else. Okay. And maybe, because it's also a bit linked to what was just discussed, I don't know if you've tried to maybe predict the income for one last period for individuals that you already had information on, and see how that reacts and how it changes.
You mean
like I know, based on the matching, predicting income for someone who is 30 to 35, but that you actually have in the database, and you can just compare the prediction to the income and look how this might impact.
That's a great idea. Yeah,
that could give us some type of a goodness of fit.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's a great point. We haven't done it, but that's a great suggestion.
That's a great point.
Because that would allow you to correct maybe for any contextual factors or for the timing of entering the labor market. Because my point was that if people enter the labor market during an economic crisis, their earnings will be impacted, and then you match them on people who have not entered the labor market during a crisis. So I think Murray also had a point, and given that we had invited Josh, I'll also invite Murray. And
Anda, can I actually comment on that before you do? Just so that I understand it, or just to make the example more concrete. So you're saying, let's say we've got valid observations for an individual from age 26 to 35. We match them. We do the matching as we usually do with someone, with somebody else who overlaps with that age range. So we can compare the observed wages or whatever of that individual that we use for the matching with the individual that we actually match with. Is that sort of the intuition?
It doesn't need to overlap with the entire
right.
with all the periods. It just needs to overlap with one or two of the last periods to allow you to see how good is your matching in terms of incomes.
Yeah.
Okay. So Murray's point, I don't know if he wants to come on stage, that there are critical age windows somewhere in the middle. That would be really interesting, but relative to very young and very old. That's true. And again, I think this is a point that it's even more valid in terms of gender, where we have this this peak fertility, I would say, where you might have gaps in the career that might impact them. I don't know if one of you wants to react to Murray's point. Who is actually, I think, who will join us shortly. Those takes a bit longer for people to join in on the stage. But if you want to start reacting to this, feel free.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I don't see immediately how one would go about doing that. Maybe, let's say an example might be, if I'm understanding correctly, that losing a job when you're 35 is much worse for you in terms of your career trajectory, your labor market trajectory, than losing a job when you're 22. And maybe because we are matching with actual observations based on labor market characteristics like these, we would see that sort of stickiness, that persistence. If that is occurring, we might see that persistence over the life course. Then it's just a matter of isolating whether the loss of a job makes a bigger difference in terms of one's labor market trajectory at a certain age compared to another. I mean, for instance, just going back to these age earnings profile, which include unemployment dynamics, we see that people are losing, even those with tertiary education or white South Africans, the labor market participation is decreasing from the late 40s onwards. So we might see the loss of a job at an age like that have more persistent effects. It's more difficult to get back on your feet than earlier in the life course, perhaps. And maybe we can observe that. We just need to look for it.
Okay.
Although, to put the 2 points together, I mean, Anna's point, which is that we have observational data which you can use to test the quality of the match. That, to the extent that maybe if we can put it together with Murray's comment here, it's almost like it gives us at least something beyond conjecture. Because, I mean, my prior to Murray's comment is, yeah, but a priori, you just don't know what's critical. Like, how would you define critical? There's always going to be anomalies, right? You've got several layers of matching and several, like, there's always going to be something weird that's happening. So what would qualify as being a critical age window? But Anda's suggestion actually, it gives us kind of an objective measure of, let's say it has a certain degree of accuracy, an R squared of, I don't know, 0.5, just for example. And then there's certain ages where it just starts to go completely off.
Mm.
That itself would be an interesting piece of data, because that would be at least kind of reconciling with Marie's suggestion here, that there may be some places where things start to change and substantially change. You know, that like your prior history, which is what we're using, isn't a very good proxy for your future income.
Right.
Huh.
Okay. So I think there are maybe no other questions for now. So I will maybe just stop here. Thank you so much to both of you for being here, for having presented those, for answering the questions. I'll switch to my, and a huge thank you to everyone attending. Next week we'll again meet you at 5 p.m. Paris time, and next week we'll be talking about water services and inequality in urban settings in Bolivia. So huge thank you again to everyone, and looking forward to seeing you for our next session of the webinar. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.